Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It is 9 o'clock in the morning in Geneva, so we are starting our session, second session of the virtual introductory trade policy course for LDCs. I welcome you all back very warmly, and also especially those who, for some reason, were not able to connect on Monday, but who are with us today. If those who are connecting for the first time today have any questions, perhaps you can approach us at break time or after the course. I will stay for a few minutes connected today in case you have any questions. And I also hope that you all have been able to connect to e-learning. If you had any problems with this, please contact e-learning at elearning@wto.org. Okay, I thought of starting today a little bit lightly because I have very little time to talk to you about the WTO. I wouldn't be able to cover anything really in depth, but I will try to signal certain things that hopefully will be of use to you. Maybe you never heard it, maybe you have never been at the WTO, so you have not seen it from the inside. In fact, I have a little poll, just 3 questions, and I'd like Marinette to launch the first questions. You will be just asked to select one answer from the first questions, and for the for the second and third question, you have multiple choice to select many more answers. So if I can ask Marinette to launch the poll, these are not difficult questions. This is just to see how you are interacting with issues of the WTO or with the WTO stuff. So here we have a question. 1, have you ever been to the WTO building in Geneva? I see that there is 19 of us connected and I have 13 answers. We will see if there is any more participants who are connecting and will give us an answer. So now I can see that many of you have never had a chance to be in Geneva to experience the WTO itself, either in meeting or in training. And I think that's why I will be using pictures in my presentation to bring the WTO closer to you, because in fact you are probably furnishing information to your management or your colleagues and to your mission, and you're working on WTO issues, but for some reason you have not had the chance to be at the WTO yet. So I can see that 3/4 of you have not been there yet. Well, let's hope you will come to Geneva one day and participate either in meetings or in training. So let's move to question 2. If you have ever prepared trade policy related documents or inputs, please indicate which ones, and you can select more than one. You can see that the list is long of choices, so you can scroll on that poll list and select more than one item. Okay, we have 15 people who have already selected, and now we can see that we have clear winners, that indeed you are involved in trade or WTO related matters, and you most likely discuss it within your ministry or in interdepartmental consultation. You prepare briefing notes for minister or senior management, something that I have done often when I worked in the public sector, in fact, in the Canadian government, first for the Ministry of Agriculture and then for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. And I can also see you preparing your colleagues who are part of the negotiating team, or maybe you are part of that team as well, and you join for meetings, negotiating meetings. And there is some of you who have never done it before, and that's why you are taking the introductory course, so you can actually be of help to your government once you learn the rules of the multilateral trading system. Very good. So let's move to the third. Question. In your work related to trade or the WTO, which resources do you often consult? And you can also select more than one. You can scroll down the list of choices. Okay, now 15 people have already answered out of 25 that can do that. I take a few more votes. And it seems that the clear winners here are that you consult your colleagues in the ministry or in other ministries, which is very good choice. Those with bigger experience and expertise are a great source of information because they have been exposed already to the WTO issues. And then we have information data available on the WTO website, meaning that you are familiar with our website. And in my presentation today, I will also highlight some of the neat, very interesting things that are already there. So you can copy them, take them from the website as processed information and insert it into your briefing notes or into your reports. And as well, you are consulting documents and publications of other international organizations, as well as text of the various WTO agreements. That means that you are not a stranger to legal texts, and that you are actually looking into the text of the agreements and the provisions. And I will highlight some of those as we go through the presentation, and I will work from the structure of those agreements. So you have an overview look, a look from above at what WTO does and how the WTO agreements are structured and are implemented through the and I will go into my presentation to start the presentation. I thank you very much for participating in this little survey, which essentially was to use the possibility within the Zoom for this poll. And for those for whom this was done for the first time, now you became familiar, and should we use this tool again, you will know how to use it. It is quite interesting that we can construct such a poll with questions in the Zoom itself. Okay, let me now try to share my screen and start the presentation. And I will go on until 9:40, and then we will take a break for 10 minutes, and I would ask you to come back at 9:50 so that Danielle can start with this part on basic principles. So, well, here is a map of LDCs, and it includes WTO members and observers. The group is about 40 members and observers, and it's a sizable part of WTO membership. About 1/5 are LDCs. And this particular group is now chaired by the ambassador of Chad, and the membership rotates among the LDCs. So at some point, a representative of your country can be chairing this group, which is pursuing issues of interest to LDCs in various committees, in negotiations, in informal meetings, so that the LDCs can hook up and explore issues of interest to them. I hope that this map is interesting to show also a distribution of many of you who are sitting in the room, essentially comprised of countries from Africa, Asia, and Pacific, and we also have Haiti in the Western Hemisphere, but we don't have a participant from Haiti. Let's open the door and peek through the window of the WTO. I will not dwell too much on history, and you will see that my presentation is self-explanatory regarding the history, but I will cover the main roles and functions of the WTO because they demonstrate the breadth of the coverage that this institution has. And it covers many areas of economic activity. And that's why membership in WTO is such a significant thing. And that's why we still have about 24 of observers who are trying to join this organization. In the conduct of its business, when members discuss, negotiate, analyze, monitor, or settle disputes in the WTO, the Secretariat helps with issuing either documentations that are official documents of the members or observers, or its own publications. And sometimes they remind us of the breadth and the depth of work that cited 30 years, and this is an interesting occurrence that I will mention later, already a few years ago, of 30 years of trade policy review mechanism. There is publication on one-page summaries of cases, which give you information about the findings of all of the cases in dispute settlement. We provide information on our training and capacity building activities. The Secretariat issues a World Trade Report every year with a different theme. Sometimes it is related to technical barriers to trade, to full employment or employment issues, jobs and employment. The last report was related to government policies in innovation and digital trade. And also it issues specific reports that may be of interest to group of countries, like this one, for example, strengthening Africa's capacity to trade. So as officials, you can take advantage of these publications in your own work, and perhaps inspire your own briefings, analytical papers, or analytical pieces where you are sharing this within your own ministry or within different departments, or perhaps in consultations with the private sector. Regarding the history, suffice it to say that the WTO system has been around for over 70 years, established in 1948 until 1994. It was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And as a result of the 8th round of the negotiations, so-called Uruguay round, the WTO was created, and it came into force on January 1, 1995. I have included a couple of pictures here of the library, the main foyer, as well as on the left-hand side, a room W, which saw majority of the rounds negotiations. In this room, many cigarettes and cigars have been smoked, not anymore because WTO had become a smoke-free environment. But in this particular room, many of the previous rounds have been concluded, and I must say successfully. Now, regarding the WTO itself, we have had ministerial conferences, which are the meetings of the topmost decision-making body of the WTO, taking place almost every 2 years. That's what they are mandated to happen every 2 years. After the Uruguay round, there were mandated negotiations already to start in agriculture and in services, and they did start in 2000. And they were incorporated into this current round called the Doha Development Agenda, the DA, which was launched in Doha, Qatar in 2001. After that, there were a number of ministerial meetings with more or less success. Some of them ended just in a ministerial statement, some others in a declaration or in a decision. And I want to add here that throughout this time, between 1995 and 2001, there were also other developments taking place. For example, there was an agreement on information technology agreement, which came into effect in 1997. There was a revision of the government procurement agreement, which took place in 2014. There was also an interesting package at Bali, where trade facilitation agreement negotiations were concluded. In Nairobi, members agreed to eliminate export subsidies. Throughout these ministerial meetings, there were also developments regarding developing countries and least developed countries. For example, in Doha, members agreed to provide technical assistance to developing countries and Ldcs. And from that document, the mandate to provide technical assistance and capacity building stems for us, for our division to provide technical assistance and for other division to provide training and TA. In 2005 in Hong Kong, members launched something called the Aid for Trade to help address supply side concerns and to help build infrastructure so that developing countries, including the Ldcs, can integrate better into the MTS and take advantage of trade. So there were developments that were taking place since 1995, which sort of expanded this scope of the WTO agreement, which essentially rests on the results of the negotiations of the Uruguay round. I have 3 pictures here as well, because not only the rules have been upgraded a little bit throughout this time, but we had modernization of the site in Geneva. At the top, you see what we call the council room. the biggest room in the WTO where about 300 delegates can attend a meeting. And at the bottom, you can see the renovation of the old building where we have created something called the atrium, the meeting place with a little cafeteria where most people take a coffee and perhaps approach another delegate to discuss a sensitive issue informally, as well as a new building which was erected in 2013, and it houses some of the divisions, especially the administration and languages division of the WTO, and it contains also a cafeteria. So if you come to Geneva, to the WTO, you will have an image in your head of some of these pictures, so you will not feel a stranger when you are going around the building and around the site. Now, there were differences between the GATT and the WTO. GATT was a provisional agreement, and it calls its participants contracting parties. In fact, it was signed by only 23 participants, and the membership then grew. So when WTO was already coming to come into force, 123 participants signed the Uruguay round result, and the international organization was created. And from that point on, the participants to that agreement are called members. Now, GATT had a limited coverage. It generally only related to goods, and the early rounds concerned only tariff and market access negotiations. Now, the WTO agreement has a much broader coverage. It includes goods, services, and trips, and it covers areas such as technical barriers to trade, sanitary and phytosanitary issues. Customs agreement may encompass rules of origin, customs valuation, pre-shipment inspection. And there is also, for example, a sectoral agreement that concerns agriculture specifically. So the scope of the coverage of the multilateral rules was significantly expanded with the creation of the WTO. This also happened with the dispute settlement, which essentially was covered in Article 22 and 23 of the GATT 1947. And now the WTO has a dispute settlement understanding which outlines the rules and procedures that govern settlement of disputes. So it's much more formal process, described in much more detail, with deadlines specifically built in, with procedures specifically outlined, so that this process unfolds in a very rule-based manner. And I can also show you here on the left-hand side the old image of the internal courtyard, which used to be open, and we used to have a fountain and the rain falling on people's hands when they were smoking in that area. And now we have the closed atrium with a roof over our head and over the head of the delegates who are stepping out from the meetings, and they can grab a coffee and discuss an issue. So now, what is the focus of the WTO? If you look at the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement establishing the WTO, there is no mention of free trade. It is not to pursue free trade, but it is to use trade barriers reduction, especially tariff reductions, and elimination of discriminatory measure as steps towards achieving objectives such as raising standards of living, full employment, growth of real income and demand, expanding production and trade of goods and services, and doing that in keeping in mind such objectives and greater public goods as the environment, sustainable development. And in the preamble members also mentioned that positive efforts need to be made to ensure that developing countries and LDCs secure a share in the growth of international trade commensurate with their needs and economic development. So please keep in mind that indeed free trade is not an objective of the WTO, but progressive liberalization and elimination of discriminatory measures is to be pursued to facilitate the objectives of those broader economic and social development of the countries. Now, again, within the conduct of its business, members submit number of documents, data, information pieces, and they are obliged to notify every year. You will be covering transparency provisions in the session towards the end of the course, and they are humongous, enormous. The notification requirements to each committee are fairly extensive, although they are not as extensive for the LDCs, as you have some flexibilities regarding that. But Secretariat, on the basis of information submitted and those 177,000 pieces of documentation, establish number of databases that now serve to expose, to demonstrate the data and information that have been notified and provided by members. And on the right-hand side, I show you a list of examples of essentially a small portion of the databases and tools that are available to members, especially related to market access, and that relates to tariffs and non-tariff measures. I'd like to highlight here as well the annual report, which goes over the 5 main areas of the functions of the WTO. I will cover 5, in fact, today. The 6th one is cooperation with other international organizations to ensure coherence in the conduct of economic policies. And that means cooperation with such entities like the World Bank or the IMF. But details of each of the areas of the main functions of the WTO, you can each year consult in our annual report. Additionally, for example, for those who are working in market access, we issue such things as trade profiles and world tariff profiles, which are great summaries of information per member of categories of tariffs and trade-related information that refers to market access. Now, among those 5 issues that I will be covering is implementation of the agreements, WTO serving as a negotiating forum, a place to settle disputes, a place to monitor members' national trade policies, and in the function of building trade capacity through technical cooperation and technical assistance is our core element of business of the WTO, as well as a core element of the development dimension. Let's focus on the implementation of the agreements, which essentially is related to the set of the legal rules that are encompassed in that book called Legal Text. Those who have the green book should not panic, because the new book is now in violet form. This number of agreements stemming from GATT 1947, and then 12 multilateral agreements on trade and goods were added, including the latest one called the Trade Facilitation Agreement. It encompasses the trade and services, GAS, and schedules of specific commitment-related services, as well as trade-related intellectual property. So this Annex 1 contains the multilateral agreements, plus Annex 2, dispute settlement understanding, and the trade policy review mechanism. It encompasses multilateral trade agreements that apply to all members. And this package was accepted at Uruguay round, plus the TFA more recently, by all members. Now, there are also plurilateral agreements, civil aircraft and government procurement stemming from the Uruguay round, which apply only to members who decide to accede to those agreements. And for some of the acceding governments, you may encounter requests from members to join these agreements to expand membership to the civil aircraft and government procurement agreements, but they are to be negotiated separately from your own accession to the WTO when you assume the rights and obligations under the set of multilateral agreements that are mentioned in Annex 1, 1A, 1B, and 1C, Annex 2, and Annex 3. Now, what are the general rules? The members take decisions in the WTO. It is not the board of directors or the secretariat. And therefore, members decide on all matters related to the agreements that they have undertaken. Most of the time, the committees and bodies in which discussions take place are chaired by ambassador or the permanent representative. Sometimes the lower level bodies can be chaired by another representative from the mission. But essentially, WTO operates on the basis of principal consensus, where all members agree to a decision being taken or a report being adopted. There is a possibility for voting, and there are 4 instances in which voting is possible, and it takes place needed, or waiver needs to be granted. And in this case, 3/4 of the membership present at the ministerial conference constitute majority to take those decisions. Another situation is when there is a need for amendments made to any of the multilateral trade agreements, or during the ministerial conference or general council meeting, there is a decision to be taken on accessions. And in the last situation, 2/3 of the members present at the meeting is sufficient to take a decision. However, it's become customary and practical that essentially all decisions are being taken by consensus. And that consensus is sometimes worked out by extensive consultations, including informal consultations in various configurations, so that members can agree and the result is acceptable to all. Now, the single undertaking has been a term that was coined during the Uruguay round, and it means that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, meaning that the package of commitments or agreements that needs to be adopted is acceptable to all, and all agree to undertake those obligations. Transparency is the main value and objective of the WTO, whereby there is a need to publicize trade regulations and so that trade and traders can undertake their business within very specified and known trading conditions, and there will be no possibility of arbitrarily changing those provisions and therefore changing conditions of the business operators. A large component of WTO members are developing countries and LDCs. In fact, 3/4 of the WTO membership. Therefore, development is at the heart of the WTO, and it has also become part and is at heart of the DDA. It is contained in various ways. In specific agreements like TBT or NSPS, there are specific S&T provisions. In negotiations, members negotiate longer transition periods or flexibilities that apply to developing countries or to LDCs. I already mentioned technical assistance and aid for trade, and I should also add another element of interest to LDCs, which is the enhanced integrated framework, which provides assistance to LDCs specifically to help them in trade relations. I will not cover such basic principles as exceptions like the non-discrimination, the most favored nation, national treatment, and exceptions, as Danielle in a moment will be covering it. Essentially, in the WTO, Ministerial Conference is the highest and the top decision-making body. When it is not meeting, the General Council takes the role of a decision-making body, and the General Council can meet as policy review body or as dispute settlement body, and it always has specific rules and procedures. As part of the DSP, we have also the establishment of the DS panels and the appellate body, which at this moment is not active as the terms of appointments of all 7 appellate body members have expired. Underneath the General Council, there are some Services Council and the TRIPS Council. And within the Goods and Services Council, there is also additional committees, lower level committees that explore specific issues like TBT, SDS, agriculture, for example, and under Services Council, for example, domestic regulation. And we have additional committees that somewhat discussing issues such as Committee on Development, on Trade and Environment, on Trade and Regional Trade Agreement, issues of balance of payments, and the cross-cutting and overarching committee, which is called the Administration, Finance and Budget Committee, which essentially looks at the operational secretariat and discusses and adopts a budget for our organization. There is also something called the working parties, which are constructed to follow and to facilitate negotiations of the accessions. So the members of our course who are coming from the acceding governments are essentially interacting with the membership through the working party negotiations. Now, at the secretariat, at the top of the secretariat, there is a head of the secretariat, Director General, Dr. Nozi Ivela, who has started to be our Director General as of 1 March 2021, and is the first woman as well as the first person from Africa to be our Director General. In terms of the membership, the latest 2 accessions took place in July 2016, and they were Liberia and Afghanistan. And in terms of the accessions, it is not only states, but it's just separate customs territories that have full autonomy in the conduct of their external relations that can apply for membership in the WTO. And they have to undergo an accession process through multilateral and bilateral negotiations to complete this process and accede to the WTO. And the decision about accession is taken by the Ministerial Conference, or if it is not meeting by the General Council. The Secretariat is comprised of about 620 regular staff and a budget of 197 million. Now, in terms of trade negotiations, the DEA negotiations are undertaken and that have been in areas that have been mandated in the existing bodies already, with the exception of non-agricultural market access, which takes place in the group called non-agricultural market access, NAMA, and the rules negotiations, for example, for fisheries negotiations. And I have highlighted the fact that trade facilitation negotiations were taking place also in an additional body, but they have been concluded already. Therefore, there is no need for this committee to meet in the negotiating forum anymore. And a committee on trade facilitation was created to now oversee implementation and administration of the trade facilitation agreement. It was concluded at the Bali Ministerial Conference and entered into force on 22 February in 2017. I'd like to highlight here some tools for you. For example, I pulled out the statistics on the percentage of the ratification of this agreement, as well as the stage of implementation of the agreement from the website. And I provided you with the specific references, as well as the map that if you hover over the member, it shows you the level of advancement in terms of implementation of the agreement. As you may very well be aware, this is aimed at simplification and harmonization and faster movement, release, and clearance of goods at the border, and cooperation of the customs authorities and border agencies authorities. And therefore, members, developing members, and especially the LDCs, had an opportunity to stage the implementation of the agreement through category A, B, and C. And they have been also now able to seek technical assistance necessary, including the donors who would be in a position to finance technical assistance and training to help them with the implementation of this agreement. Now, regarding the transparency element of the WTO, I mentioned that the trade policy review mechanism already existing over 30 years because it was established during the Uruguay round in 1989 is the main element of this part of the function of the WTO. I'd like to flag that as of 2008, Secretariat has been engaged in trade monitoring of developments and has been issuing twice yearly reports on trade facilitating and trade restricting measures that the members and observers have been implemented since the wake of the financial crisis. Now, the permanent and the long-standing item of the trade policy review mechanism is essentially meant to review national policies and to analyze it in the context of what kind of impact they may have on the multilateral trading system. It is a peer review. It is not basis for dispute settlement. It is meant to be a discussion of a member's trade policy and the direction of that trade policy. And members often provide encouragement so that members under the review move in the direction of the full implementation of their commitments and the spirit of the agreements. Do not panic. The 7.00 on the screen in the picture, it doesn't mean that the meeting starts at 7 o'clock. It means essentially that the interventions of members in the first day of the policy review are limited to 7 minutes. And as far as I know, this is the only committee where actually a time limit has been instituted by the Secretariat to allow for efficient and expeditious conduct of the trade policy reviews. And I've seen it that the time is clicking and members often finish their intervention just in the last seconds before the 7 minutes are up. In fact, it shows that they have prepared and timed their statements so they can deliver it in full within that limit. I provided you with a listing of upcoming trade policy reviews, the document WT/TPR/447-REF4, to indicate which reviews are still going to be taking place in 2001. I believe the next one will be Argentina in September. And on the right-hand side, you see just an example of a page from under the trade topics from our website, where you can see that documentation related to particular issue and particular member, and in this case, the trade policy review, can be easily searched by reviews and by country. And this yellow looking page appears for most of our trade agreements. And therefore we can easily find the documentation. Now, another function is the dispute settlement, and over 600 cases have been brought forward to the DSB, but only about 450 reports have been issued. The preference is that the dispute is settled by some kind of mutual solution, by discussions, and if not, then the member, of course, has a right to move to adjudication. In this case, I wanted to demonstrate for you that a growing number of members are taking part in the dispute settlement. Number of them are taking part as third parties in a dispute brought forward by other members, and they can very well learn throughout the process should they one day be involved in a dispute settlement. As we can see, we have 51 complainants and 60 respondents who have participated directly in the dispute settlement proceedings, and about 90 members who have learned from this process and actively participated as a third party. The dispute settlement understanding has specific rules for conducting, for establishing a panel, for a panel of experts to issue a report, for dispute settlement body to adopt a report, and if there is a need for appeal and a member has a right to appeal, also for procedures under the appellate body. As I have already mentioned, this step in the dispute settlement process is now inactive as there is no members of the appellate body. We can also see that within the dispute settlement proceedings, the GATT 1994 has been the most invoked part of the rules, where members perceived that their trading partner did not act consistently with the rules. But there is also others that have been invoked, and you can consult these statistics as well on the relevant page on our website. Now, last, I come to the element of technical assistance and capacity building. The mandate for this core element of WTO business has been established in the Doha Declaration, and it is clear that it is one of the main elements of the development dimension of the system, and members, developing countries, least developed countries, as well as economies in transition, have a right to participate in training and technical assistance. We issue a biennial technical plan, technical assistance and training plan. Secretariat will be working on this plan in the coming weeks and months. At the last meeting of the Trade and Development Committee, members reviewed a report by the Secretariat on the technical assistance and training provided last year. So you can also consult that report on our webpage. Most recently, we have issued a technical copy handbook on notification requirements, which details all of the notification requirements and timelines with which members need to comply. And here, both the timeliness and the compliance with notification obligations has not been the best. And this is one of the issues that is being discussed in the WTO. In our offer of technical assistance, we have face-to-face activities as well as we have e-learning. Many of you have taken advantage of this opportunity already, either in face-to-face activity or in terms of e-learning. And we have somewhat offered a combined activity through this virtual training by having live sessions with you, and then also having for you available other technical assistance programs available through e-learning. I believe I have gone over my time by 10 minutes. I hope Danielle will not mind that I will now call this session closed, and I will provide you with 10 minutes break and ask you to come back and connect with us at 10 o'clock so that we can continue with the WTO basic principles. So this concludes the very broad and very quick overview of the WTO, the main elements only, and you will now be going within the different sessions of the rest of the course into the details of the particular issues, starting with basic principles and Danielle at 10 o'clock. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing now, and we take a 10-minute break. So please connect back at 10 o'clock. Thank you.
Basically, there are four main basic principles which constitute the pillar of the multilateral trading system. You will see that I've added a few ones because with the practice and the course of the years, there's been some principles which have taken some importance, but which are not really considered as the four basic principles. There are really four basic principles, and there are two others which are also used. And as I mentioned in the introduction, basically these obligations guide the members through what they can do in the trade relations and with the measures that they adopt when they trade with the members. And as I mentioned, also, it's these basic principles basically were defined at the very beginning of the multilateral trading system. So they were defined actually not, they come from the GATT. So they were defined in 1947. So they were negotiated at that time. You may know that we didn't have time to go really into the details of the history, but the negotiation of the GATT, of the agreement, which was supposed to be before the Havana Charter, I think, which was wider than the GATT, was negotiated in the late 40s, and these basic principles come from there, and they were just basically adopted or integrated into the WTO when the WTO was created in 1995. And there was a question about the initiatives, and the WTO is very much a forum for negotiation. So members discuss. Anything can be adopted, and actually this is why we say that it's a members-driven organization, which means that everything comes from members. Initiatives, proposals come from members. They are discussed either from one single member or for a coalition of members. And then they are negotiated, they are discussed, and flexibilities are added. So it's probably true that the basic principles will never have been adopted or accepted, and obviously included in the GATT text, in the basic principles, if there was not at the same time some flexibilities which were negotiated and incorporated in the text. So members accepted to have quite strict rules, but at the same time, in some specific circumstances, they need flexibilities. And these are the exceptions to the basic principles that we are going to see in the second time after we see the basic principles. So Marinette, if you could go to the next slide, please. So there are basically, yes, you can put everything, Marinette. Okay. There are three of those. Thank you. Basically, they have distributed, and we can use different distributions, and you can play around with these basic principles and find that they kind of have other things. But we can basically say that there are two main basic principles, which are the pillars, the foundations of the multilateral trading systems, and these are the MFN principle, the most favored nation principle, and the national treatment principle. These two principles basically have the same function. The function is that they correct or they put rules for against discrimination. So very often you will hear that the WTO is a club, and when you enter into the WTO or the GATT, when you become a contracting party of the GATT, or nowadays a member of the WTO, you join the club, and therefore you have some you obtain some privilege. And one of the privileges that you obtain is that other members of the club, of the WTO, cannot discriminate against you. And we'll see in more detail later when and how this absence of discrimination apply. There's also a very important element in trade, and if you are working for your respective governments, and you probably deal with firms, with private enterprise, and you probably know that when it comes to trade, what exporters very much need is predictability. So they want to know, they want to be sure that when they take the decision of exporting, things are not going to change drastically. There's some framework which guarantees a certain stability, and this is what basically what the second group we have created is predictability, and this is very much why we have bindings and why bindings are very important in the GATT for merchant for goods before, and nowadays also for services in the WTO. And this is the respect of bindings, and we'll see later how members have defined this obligation of having some stability and some limits in the measures that they can apply to import from other members of the WTO. Alicia has already mentioned the transparency element, which is very important, and this is something that is done through different tools or different elements in the WTO. Alicia mentioned notification. We have the trade policy review that also was mentioned by Alicia, and these are essentially instruments that members use to know better what are the measures and what is the trade policy that other members or that trade partners apply. So this is, I put it into brackets because it's important, but at the same time it's not as I wouldn't like to use the word compulsory, because there are notifications, obligations, but at the same time it's not it doesn't apply as such a big distortion as if you do not respect the MFN, the national treatment, or the bindings. So we say that kind of is an absence of transparency, but it doesn't apply a distortion in trade. So that's why it's maybe we have less cases, for example, for the absence of transparency. I mean, by cases, I mean dispute settlement cases, than, for example, for the absence of respect of bindings or for the non-respect of the MFN or the national treatment. And then another objective or tool, which is which goes with the multilateral trading system, is the objective or the possibility of having a free trade. I mean, the World Trade Organization is about trade and obviously about reduction of trade barriers. And this is why I included tariff reductions. I put it again into brackets because, as Alicia already explained, tariff reductions is not an objective per se in the WTO, and it wasn't in the GATT either, but it's a tool to reach higher objectives. And these objectives, if you are interested in having more information about these objectives, they appear in the preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement for the WTO and in the preamble of the GATT 1947. If you are interested in having some historical comparison between the objectives, you will see that they are similar, but they are not the same. Probably that the WTO objectives are wider. And as I mentioned, tariff reductions is something that is central, is crucial in the WTO. It's the main objective of the rounds of negotiations. For example, Alicia mentioned that we had 8 rounds of negotiations in the GATT, but it's not an obligation per se. It's a way between members to reach a freer trade. And finally, also a rule or a principle which is there, which is really in the rules of the WTO and of the GATT, and which I will explain a bit later, is the prohibition of quantitative restrictions, which could be quotas or other type of quantitative restrictions. And this is something which is not authorized according to the rules of the WTO. Again, there are flexibilities, there are cases where they are permitted, but within a very strict framework. And I will explain later why the reason why we have this prohibition of quantitative restrictions. But this is basically the legal principles, the basic legal principles. And these principles, you will find them in most of the agreements. So you open an agreement, any agreement of the WTO, and you will see that it's based on these basic principles. Okay. Okay, we can. So do not hesitate to ask questions if you have questions at any time. We have time. I have the session the rest of the morning today, and I can also take some time on Friday. So it's important that you clearly understand that. So we now move to the next slide. So Mainet, please. So we go now for probably the center, the most famous, the most important of these basic principles, which is the most favored nation principle. And basically what it means, the MFN, and we'll go to look into the details of this provision because it's quite important. It means that a member cannot make or apply any discrimination between like products or services originating in or destined for different countries or national of different countries with regard to the protection of IP. And this is not something that can be negotiated or can be discussed. As soon as you become member of the WTO, this right, you get this right immediately and without any condition. You obtain the best treatment given to any other trading partner. And this provision is so crucial, so important that actually it appears in Article 1 of the GATT. So it's the very first article of the GATT, in Article 2 of the GATT and Article 4 of the TRIPS. So they appear in the 3 pillars. You remember that we mentioned that there were 3 pillars: merchandise, services, and intellectual property, and they apply in each of the 3 pillars. Just for the explanations that I will do in this session, I will take as example the merchandise, the goods, because it's the first one is the one that we use most frequently. But the explanation applies almost identically to GATS or to TRIPS, with making a few changes according to the nature of the trade. So we can now move to the next slide. So this is as we are working with a virtual in a virtual environment, I've basically copied the text of the articles. You know that these articles can be found in the WTO book. If you have the legal text, then you will find them. You can also find them on the internet. So if you go to the WTO webpage, you will be able to find this the legal text and all the provisions, including in the agreements. So how does this article read? It basically said with a detail that any advantage, favor, privilege, or immunity granted by any member at the time of the GATT, it was contracting party, but here I changed it to member, to any product originating in or destined for any other country shall be accorded immediately and unconditionally to the like product originating in or destined for the territories of all other members. So I don't know if you can maybe write in the chat what would be for you important for in this part of the agreement, if I may just try to have some hint from you, or if anybody wants to say what is crucial in this part, is very welcome to take the floor or just write on the chat. I'm just giving a few seconds. Yes, that's correct. There is a question about the like products. This is very, very important. Like products, and it's so important that we have a bit later, we have a few slides to see what we understand by like products, and we'll see that it's not that easy to define. But like products is true. You cannot ask that somebody that is offering some conditions to the imports of chairs applies the same conditions to the imports of tables, for example, because they're not the same product. So there's no reason, there's no discrimination when the product is not the same. So that's central, it's true. So let's go to the next slide. You have highlighted a few elements. Thank you, Marinette. So what we could identify as important here, and you see that like product as correctly identified by Mamoun Urashik Askari, I hope that I pronounced correctly your name, is also highlighted in this slide. But something which is very important is actually that the coverage is very large. It's not just type preferences. We talk about any advantage, favor, privilege, or immunity. So it's wide. Basically, it covers everything that any measure that a member could take has to be extended to any other members. Another central point here, and it's what I already mentioned before, is that there's no condition, there's no negotiation, there's nothing that should be expected from the counterpart to extend this advantage, favor, or privilege, or immunity. It should just be done immediately and conditionally. So as soon as a member offers a privilege or some type of advantage to another trading partner, he has to extend it immediately, so just at the same time, and without requiring or asking any counter favor or any condition to the other members of the WTO. So as soon as you're a member of the WTO, if a privilege is given, then you can benefit from it. That's it. Obviously for the like products. And something also which is a kind of subtlety in this article in the Most Favored Nation is that is not necessarily how to say that you will benefit from the privilege if you are a member of the WTO, but you will also benefit from this privilege if a member of the WTO grants a privilege to any other country, be it a member or a non-member. So if country A, which is a member of the WTO, offers a privilege to country B, which is not a member of the WTO, then this privilege has to be extended to all other members of the WTO. But the other way is not correct. It means that it's not true. It means that if a member of the WTO grants a privilege to another member of the WTO, it doesn't have necessarily to extend it to any other country or to non-WTO members. So when I was mentioning the comparison with a club, this is an illustration. If that as member of the club, you will get any privilege granted to other members or non-WTO members. But if you are a non-WTO member, you cannot require that this privilege be extended to you. So that's one of the incentives to become member of the WTO, obviously. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So, in what does this cover? And actually, I've inverted the order of the article. Is with respect to custom duties and charges of any kind imposed on or in connection with importation or exportation, or imposed on the international transfer of payments for imports or exports, and with respect to the method of levying such duties and charges, and with respect to all rules and formalities in connection with importation and exportation. So again, here what I like to indicate here, and Mainet, maybe you can go to the next slide because it will highlight is that again the coverage of the MFN is very broad and wide. It basically applies to anything, customs duties, charges. So, but not only customs duties and charges, not only to what you have to pay, but also to some rules and formalities, which means that you cannot require certain, for example, technical requirements to some products coming from a specific country or member of the WTO, and be stricter or less strict for other WTO members. So you have to offer the same conditions, not only in terms of what is paid, but on the rules that apply to the members, or also for the method of levying the duties and charges to any of these products. So this is also very important. It applies to what you have to pay, but also to the rules and the formalities. So you cannot ask, for example, for if you have imports coming from a specific country, you just have to fill in one form. And for imports coming from other WTO members, they have to fill in, say, 10 forms to fulfill with the import requirements. So this is very important also. And something also which is we very often, and this is normal, we very often stress that in terms of imports, but they also apply to exports. So it's not only to the imports coming into the country, but it also applies to the exports that goes out from your country and goes to a specific members of the WTO. But obviously this is very often less, it makes less, it raises less controversy because the most important in this case is obviously imports, but it also applies to both the imports and exports. So I don't know if there is any question. No, if not the case, then we go to the next slide. And here what I've done is just I have you have the full article. As we were not sure that you would have the legal text, I've just reproduced the full article. So very often when we talk about the MFN treatment, we often think about measures which are applied at the border, because the Mfn principle applies to imports coming from different or various trading partners. Okay, so we offer the same treatment to different imports coming from different origins. So that's why we very often think about measures which are applied at the border, which is most of the case true, but at the same time is not limited to that, because we could have some rules or formality that apply inside the country, and if they differentiate between products coming from different importers, then it's also the Mfn principle that applies. The Mfn applies to the different imports from different origins, or imports from different partners, trading partners, which is one of the differences with the next basic principle that we can go to the next slide, which is, in this case, the national treatment. Okay, and the national treatment, unlike the Mfn, which applies to imports from different, which compares imports coming from different origins, in the case of the national treatment, what we compare is imports with the treatment of the like product, of the same product produced internally. So basically what we try to do is that the foreign goods, services, and service providers, as well as IPR holders, must not be discriminated against vis-à-vis domestic goods, services, and service providers, as well as IPR holders. So basically the same treatment that is applied to domestic product should be extended once the duties are paid, once the border is crossed, basically, to products coming from trading partners, WTO members, trading partners. You can see here the difference which I mentioned. The principle is the same, but in the case of merchandise or goods, the principle applies to the merchandise, to the goods. In the case of services, because of the specificity of trading services, the basic principle, the national treatment, as well as the Mfn principle, applies to both the services and the service providers when it's the case, when it's relevant. And for in the case of intellectual property, this basic principle applies to the IPR holders. So we cannot discriminate between the IPR holders, which means the owner of the IPR, of the IP rights. And in the case of services, you can see that there is a small difference between services and goods in the application of the national treatment. In the case of the Mfn, okay, I will. In the case of the Mfn, this privilege or this principle, this right applies to all services and goods, being even if there is a commitment or not. So it's not important to know if this the country has taken a commitment on the specific service or on the specific good. In this case, the Mfn applies in any case to all products and to all services. It's also true for national treatment in terms of merchandise. For merchandise, the national treatment applies in any case, even if we'll see after the binding what are the bindings, but just think that even if a country has not taken any commitment in terms of binding for a specific product, for a specific merchandise, then the national treatment applies. This is not true for services. For services, and you will see that in detail, so I will not go into this detail now, but for services, the national treatment applies only in the case of the services for which the member has taken a specific commitment and is therefore recorded on the specific member schedule of specific commitments. So if the service is not, if the member has not taken any commitment on the specific service, which means that there's no obligation of market access opening in terms of services, then the national treatment does not apply to this specific service. So that's a kind of difference between services and goods. There are two questions. Which have arrived through the chat. So the first one is, would you please elaborate how IPR holders may be treated equally? Yes. So you will have a session. IPR is intellectual property right. IP, intellectual property, are right, TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property rights. So yes, we very often have a jargon in the WTO. So you will see that we use acronyms. If you do not understand a specific acronym, do not hesitate to ask. It's almost automatic that we use that. So IPR, intellectual property rights. So you will have a session on TRIPS where you will see the different type of rights covered in the TRIPS and also in the different conventions of the WIPO. Basically, to make it very simple, because you will see that into much more detail when you have the specific TRIPS session. There are different type of rights that you can hold. There are industrial rights, for example, patents, trademarks. There are industrial rights, and there are other type of rights like copyright or this type of rights which are more related with artistical creations. Okay, that IP rights are a bit complicated because you need to, some of them you need to record them, you need to register, others are granted automatically. But basically the IPR, the intellectual property rights, offer some protection for the IPR holder. For example, for music, the minimum is, I think, is 50 years of protection after the lifespan of the person plus 50 years of protection. Okay, so this is the minimum that you have to grant to any IPR holder. There is patents is 20 years. So treated equally, for example, means that the same conditions should apply in terms of protection. You cannot grant a protection of, say, 40 years for a patent, which is, for example, when you create a medicine or you invent something, you have to register this invention and you get a patent, which is a right of exclusivity. So in this case, you cannot, for example, grant a protection of 40 years to your national IPR holders, which means the nationals who have invented something like a medicine, for example, and at the same time offer only 20 years to IPR holders from other countries. So treating equally means offering the same protection, the same duration for the protections, the same type of protection, the same conditions for registering, for example, a patent or a trademark. So this is what we understand by treating equally. But again, as I mentioned, you will have a session on TRIPS where all these different type of rights will be explained and the different protection will also be explained. The second question is how like products are determined. Is there any single method? I will keep this question for later because we have, I think, 2 or 3 slides on like products, and we'll come to that. Okay, so the national treatment is a bit more complicated than the MFN in the sense that there are in Article 3, there are different type of protections which are offered. Okay, how are similar products determined? We'll see that later. It's interesting. Okay, so Mainet, could you please go to the next slide, please? Okay, so in Article 3 of the GATT, you will see that there are different paragraphs, and each paragraph deals with a specific type of protection or yes, type of measure. And you have also in Article 3, the most used paragraph in Article 3 are Article 3.1, 3.2, and 3.4. These are the three paragraphs which are the most frequently used, and that's what we are going to see. But if you are interested in reading Article 3, you will see that there are a few exceptions in, I think it's paragraph 8 and the following paragraph, which deals with subsidies and which also deal with government procurement. So these are exceptions to the national treatment. Okay, but for the moment we just focus on the main provisions of Article 3, and the general principle of Article 3 is stated in its first paragraph. So as soon as you start reading Article 3, you will understand what is national treatment about, and this is what is bold in my slide. It gives all the elements which are covered by Article 3, internal taxes or the internal charges, laws, regulations, and what they say is that they should not be applied to imported or domestic products so as to afford protection to domestic production. So the main objective, the main principle of Article 3 is to avoid that a specific member, that a specific government uses internal taxes or rules to favor its domestic protection. So what we want to give is the same conditions of competition to imported products, which come from obviously the WTO members, to those products which are produced domestically. So that's the general principle. The principle is it's not permitted that a country creates conditions, either by law, by rules, or by some taxes, to give a privilege to the national producers. Okay, the only discrimination basically which is permitted in the WTO are the duties. So this is the way the customs duties are the only instrument which is permitted under the WTO rules to give some type of privilege or to give some type of favor to national producers. Once the imports have paid the customs duties, basically the conditions should be the same. So let's go now to the next slide, please. Okay, so we start now with paragraph 2 of Article 3, which deals with anything you have to pay, basically. Okay, so we are talking here about anything that has to be paid, like taxes internally. Okay, and you will see that this article, this second paragraph of Article 3, differentiate between two different types of products, and this is why I want to come back on what is like products, similar products, which has been a question which has been raised in the chat. So basically, what this first sentence of Article 3.2 says is that the products of the territory of any member imported into the territory of any other member shall not be subject directly or indirectly to internal taxes or other internal charges of any kind in excess of those applied directly or indirectly to like domestic products. Basically, if you have a tax, a charge, which is imposed on the domestic products, then the same tax or the same charge should be imposed to imported products. And it's interesting because the article does not say the same charges. It says that it shouldn't be in excess, which means that actually if you want to charge more on your national products, you could. It wouldn't go against the national treatment principle, but obviously countries will not do that. They will not, or it's very little probable that they will do that. They will not have worse competition conditions for the national production. I mean, they want usually to help the national producers, but the national treatment does not say that they have to be the same. They just say that it shouldn't be in excess. And when we say in excess, it means that if it's a like domestic product, it shouldn't be even in excess of one cent. So it really should not be excess, those which are applied directly or indirectly to like domestic products. So we can go to the next slide, which is basically highlighting what I just mentioned. This part of the Article 3.2 deals with what you have to pay, internal taxes or other internal charges. But this article, this paragraph 2, then continues with a second sentence. And the second sentence, if you can go to the next slide. Thank you. It's for products which are not like products, and this is why we'll take some time also to discuss about like products. They're not like products, then they could not qualify as being like products, but at the same time, they're products which directly compete against this national product, or could even replace or substitute the national like product. We call that directly competitive or substitutable products. And in this case, the condition is not as stringent, as strict as for like products. For like products, it's clear. It's not whatever you tax, whichever charge you apply to national products, you should apply a charge which is not higher to like imported products. Okay, but for those products which are not like products, which we could compete against these products, what they ask is that these internal taxes or charges to imported or domestic products, they should be applied in a manner which is not contrary to the principle set forth in paragraph 1. Okay, and if you remember, I will go back to the paragraph 1. Paragraph 1, what they say is that they should not be applied to imported or domestic products so as to afford protection to domestic products. So here in this case, we are not talking anymore about applying exactly the same tax or a tax which is not higher, but applying the tax or the charge which is not in a manner which provides some protection to domestic products. So it's a bit more flexible. It shouldn't be exactly the same, but if there is any difference between the tax that you apply to imported products, the difference should not provide a protection to domestic products. There's no more details, but this is how it is stated. So I can see that there are some questions coming on the chat. Is it possible to get an example on the national treatment to bring out the principle well? Taxes, charges, and fees could not be exceeded, but tariffs depend on the country's schedule of commitments. Yes, so the first one, the example, we can take any example if you want. We can take, and I will maybe give some examples in when we see like products, because the difficulty actually is very much on defining what is a like product. And I will come back to that later. Let me just check if we are on time according to the program, because I have maybe a time control which is less good than Alicia's. Right here I have the program. Okay, let me just go, if I may, I will just finish this, the national treatment, and then we take the break before dealing with like products, okay? So we have some kind of logic. I would just like to finish the national treatment. Yes, Sitana, you are right. Taxes, charges, and fees are not tariff. And that's why we have some conditions also about the binding of the tariff. And we have to be very clear about what are the taxes and what are the duties. The duties, as you mentioned, and we'll see that later, and we will see that in more details on Friday. No, not on Friday, on Monday, because it's on Monday we'll deal with market access, and this is when I will explain with more details how tariff works in the WTO. They are reported in two different places, in the national tariff schedule and in the schedule of commitments of the WTO. And I will explain on Monday how we use these two sources of information. But you are correct, and this is why I mentioned that the duties are the only protection which is authorized in the WTO. You could have any duty you want, any tariff duty you want, at the condition that it respects your commitments, and the commitments are taken in the schedules of commitments. So I will come back to that on Monday. So I will not explain it further, but you are right. The taxes are, for example, the VAT. We are talking, for example, of the VAT. Many countries have a value-added tax. So, for example, the value-added tax should not be different from when it's applied to national products to imported products. Okay. I have another question here, which is MFN and national treatment are very broad to implement since they both are non-discrimination principles. What if the government of members want to protect their infant industries, and how they both links to the schedule of commitments and concessions? There are some flexibilities. There are some flexibilities for, here we're going much further into the explanation. Here I'm really explaining the main principles, but there is some flexibilities in the GATT about infant industries. It is a kind of safeguard for that. I don't remember now by heart if it's Article 18. It's around these articles. I will find during the break, and I will come back to that. I will not explain in details, but for developing countries, there are some special flexibilities in terms of infant industries and safeguard for infant industries. So these are provisions for that. And when you use a flexibility, it's an exception. So you can go beyond the commitments that you have taken. So the flexibilities that we are going to see later, there are provisions which allow members in certain circumstances. So in this case, you must prove that there are infant industries. So it shouldn't be an industry which is there for 50 years. Which this infant industry has some problems, and you can apply some additional protection, which wouldn't be authorized otherwise. So these flexibilities allow you to take some additional measures which are against or which are in breach of the basic principles. If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, we can move that. This is just the main points of the second sentence. So next slide, please. Okay, so here we now have the second facet of the national treatment. We have seen that there is Article 3.2 on charges or taxes, so whatever you pay, but there's also a non-discrimination obligation on whatever is rules or regulations. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Yes. So in this case, we are not talking anymore about what you have to pay, so the taxes, but what are the rules which apply to your country. So here, Article 3, paragraph 4 is very clear, which says that the products of the territory of any member imported into the territory of any other member shall be accorded a treatment no less favorable than that accorded to like products of national origin in respect of all laws, regulations, and requirements affecting the internal sale, offering for sale, purchase, transportation, distribution, or use. So again, it's really broad. It covers everything. So what does it mean? So not only you cannot apply different charges or taxes, so this is totally forbidden, but in addition to that, you cannot have different rules which apply to like products. For example, if you are importing cars, you are producing car, and at the same time you are importing cars, you cannot, for example, say that for the national cars you don't need seat belts, for example, or you don't need the same level of protection. And for imported cars, you will need seat belts in the front seats, in the rear seats. You will need that the brakes are special with offering more protection. So whichever rule that you apply, or whichever technical requirement that you apply to your national products, they should be applied in the same way, or at least what they say in a treatment which is no less favorable. So it could be more favorable, but not less favorable to those products which are imported. So here again, non-discrimination between national products and imported products, be it at the level of the charges or be it at the level of the rules, regulations. Anything should not make the conditions for imported products more difficult than for national products. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, and here I just reproduce the same. So the first paragraph, which is the general principle, paragraph 2, which applies to taxes, is kind of summary, and paragraph 4, which applies to rules and technical requirements or any other conditions that are applied to the sale of imported products. Okay, so it's 11. I've now covered the first two non-discrimination principles. I propose that we have a break, a 10 minutes break. It will also give you the opportunity to reflect on that. Maybe you will come back to other questions. So it's on my clock, it's 11 and 1 minute past 11. So I suggest that we meet again at 11 past 10 to continue with this presentation. So I'll see you in a moment. Thank you. I think that we can continue this session. I will just stop the video because I think it's better if you're all concentrating on the slides. But just to come back, any question on the MFN national treatment? Just to reply to the question about infant industries, for those interested, you may want to consult Article 18 of the GATT. Which is governmental assistance to economic development, and in the section A of this article, which is quite long, it's a flexibility essentially for developing countries. There is a part which speaks about possibilities to promote the establishment of a particular industry, which comes back to the infant industries. So I think in any case that this type of flexibility, which are very much for which was drafted for developing countries, will be covered in the session that we have on on development and special and differential treatment. But there is something about infant industries. There are some safeguards or some flexibilities for developing countries which go beyond what other members can use. So you can read Article 18. Basically, also it could be interesting for you to read it because it's quite complicated article, and you may want to ask questions to our colleagues from the development division, which are much more familiar with this article. So I will encourage you to do so. I didn't at the beginning of the session. I just jumped into the basic principles in the presentation, and I forgot to mention how to read actually the GATT text, the GATT agreement, because as I mentioned, there's been some developments in the GATT, and there's a way to read it, and some of this presentation takes that into consideration. Actually, to make it very short, and that's something that you already know, the original GATT was drafted in the late 40s, in 1947. That's why it's called GATT 47. But since the beginning of the GATT, obviously the needs have changed, and there has been some amendments which have been made to the GATT during the GATT years. You will see that also during the development, the session on special and differential treatment. Basically, the S&D provisions have been added in the 60s. There was not much about that at the very beginning. Yes, I will come back to the GATT 94. It's a good point. I can see in the chat somebody is asking for GATT 94. But at the beginning in the GATT, before the WTO, it was just called the GATT 47 because it was adopted in 47. And as I mentioned, it was amended several times. One significant change was in the 60s, and I'm sure that our colleagues that will deal with a session on special differential treatment will speak about that. Actually, at the beginning, the S&D, the special differential treatment provisions, were not very. There were not many, and were not very. Didn't offer much flexibility. Just because if you go back to the 40s and the late 40s, there was not this big difference between the contracting parties. There was not this gap between what we call now developing and LDCs categories. There was always needed for flexibilities, all needed at the exception of one or two contracting parties, always in the situation where they needed some flexibility and to build again what was destroyed by the Second World War, basically. So the S&D provisions were added gradually, and then there come the WTO. And in the WTO, basically what we did is that we take as a basis, obviously, the GATT, what existed already, which was the GATT 47, but at the same time, they added some additional provisions or some additional rules. And this is what is called the GATT 94. And if you go, for those who have the book, or if you can go to the internet, you will see that there is the GATT 94, basically in the book is 3 pages long. Why? Because actually the GATT 94 takes the GATT 47, which already existed, and adds everything which was adopted during the 50 years of the GATT. To, for example, the enabling clause was not originally incorporated in the GATT. It was a decision that was adopted in 79. This is now kind of included. Anything which was the new commitments, type commitments, were added to the GATT 94. And there are some understandings which have been negotiated and developed, which are part of the GATT 94, but which are not part of the GATT 47, because these understandings were negotiated during the Uruguay round, and therefore they did not exist before 1995. So the GATT 94 is made of GATT 47, any decision basically taken in the 50 years of existence of the GATT, plus the understandings which were negotiated during the Uruguay round. And the way you read, therefore, the way you read a specific article in the GATT 47, you have to read the article. If there is an asterisk, like it's the case, for example, for Article 3, for Article 3 of the GATT, there is an asterisk, then you have to go and read the notes which are at the end of the GATT 47, which are explanatory notes. So you have to read that. And in addition, for some articles, you have also to read the understandings which apply to some articles of the GATT. So you have to really be exhaustive when you speak about when you read an article. So what's the difference between the ITO, the International Trade Organization, and the WTO? Why the ITO failed while the WTO failed while the WTO was established? So the ITO is the International Trade Organization, just to make it very brief because it's not the subject of this session, but the ITO is the organization that should have been created if the Havana Charter, which was negotiated in 1946-1947, had been ratified. Alicia mentioned that at the beginning of the GATT, there were some 23 countries that were negotiated the new rules. At the beginning, the ITO, International Trade Organization, was supposed to be the third pillar with the World Bank, the IMF, World Bank being anything which is reconstruction, help to the countries. IMF is the finance and money and monetary issues. And ITO was the trade pillar of these three institutions. World Bank and IMF were approved, were adopted, while the ITO was the charter, the Havana Charter was signed, but when it was sent back to the capitals, it was not ratified by some of them. It's well known that the United States did not ratify the ITO, and therefore the Havana Charter, and therefore the ITO was never established at the place to be able to negotiate and to start working on trade. What the 23 something countries made is that they signed a provisional contract, which was the GATT, an agreement, and therefore the GATT, which was provisional, supposed to be provisional, had a very long life during 50 years. And at the very end, there was the need for organization, and therefore the WTO was established in 95. So why the WTO and not the ITO? This is really very, it's questions of, in the negotiations, we talk about ripeness of the decisions. So sometimes the fruit is ripe and we can take it, and sometimes it's not ripe and we have to wait. As for negotiations, why the Millennium Goal, the Millennium negotiations, which was proposed in 1999, was not launched, while the DDA, which was proposed in 2001, was adopted just because it was the right moment and the members wanted to do this effort. It's the same for the ITO and the WTO. It's a question of moment, of timing, of being ready to do that. So this is really a parenthesis in this presentation. So I don't know if there's a question about the connection problem. I'm very sorry to read that. I don't know if other people have this same problem. So we have seen the MFN, the most favored nation principle. We have seen the national treatment. And in these two provisions and in many agreements of the WTO, we make reference to like products. So let's go to the next slide and let's see what are like products. So as you can see, like products are referred to in many of the WTO provisions, in the central principles like the MFN, the national treatment, but there's no definition about like products. So you can read the GATT or any agreement included in the WTO agreements, you will not see any part, a definition of the like products. So there's nothing official, so to say, that defines what a like product is. But with the practice, with the cases, because this is probably, I mean, understanding the rules, MFN, national treatment, is not that difficult. I mean, there are a few tricky or details that need to be understood, but it's not a big difficulty. The real difficulty is in the application of these rules, because then the difficulty is knowing what are like products. So what members have done, and Alicia already mentioned that we have a dispute settlement system. What members have done is that they have consulted and they have raised issues, or they have raised disputes officially with the dispute settlement. And there, the different panels, and later, because there was no appellate body in the GATT years, but later when in the WTO there was an appellate body which was created, there's been a kind of, there's no such a thing as jurisprudence in the WTO, but there are some historical references. And with the practice of examining the disputes, there have been some criteria that have been used to try to define or to try to work with what is a like product. And there are 4 criteria which are the most commonly used. But at the same time, these 4 criteria, they are not exhaustive, which means that in some cases, and as in the WTO, there is no precedent as such, so each panel, each case is free to maybe add another criteria or take into consideration another criteria, but these 4 criteria, or to take just 2 or 3 criteria. So there's nothing in the WTO rules which says that we have always to use these 4 criteria, or that we cannot use less than 4 criteria, or we cannot use more than 4 criteria. So the practice is that these are the 4 criteria that are most commonly used. And amongst these criteria, there is what, obviously, the description of the product. What is the properties, the nature, the quality of the product, and this goes back to the physical characteristics of the product. So obviously, if you take a chair, you know that the chair, there is some definition of what is a chair. So there are some common physical characteristics. At the same time, you have very simple chairs. You have wheels chairs. You have different type of chairs. And maybe one specific chair is not considered as a like product to another chair. So there should be some common elements in this comparison. The products and users in a given market. This is also something that is very important to understand, is that like products, even if you take the same products, and this is why it has to be defined on a case by case. So it's not because in a specific case 2 products are considered as like products, that in another case with different countries these 2 identical products will be considered as like products in the other case, because you have to take into consideration the use in a given market, and also the consumer's tastes and habits. So it's really there's no precedent. So each case is a case-by-case situation when you have to analyze the products, not only the product, but the specific market where the dispute or the different has been issued. So very important how consumers perceive and consider the products in order to satisfy a specific desire or demand. Here, the very famous case is alcoholic beverages. We all in our countries have a specific alcohol which is produced internally, which is of special interest for the citizens of these countries. But if you take this specific national alcohol in another market, it will just become a common and a normal alcohol, which compared to any other. So in one specific market, it could make sense that they are not like products, but if you take the two, say, alcoholic beverages in another market, they will be the same. So it's really in comparison to what the users of specific consumers and what is the end use in a given market. And finally, and it goes back to a question which is there, we can also take, yes, the tariff classification for each product. So HS6 or beyond, if we talk, for example, about the MFN, the leg products in a most favored nation cases, the two products which are imported will be assigned a specific HS code, which will be at the national level. And this again, I will talk about the HS codes on Monday, so I don't want to give here details about the HS code, but the tariff classification can be used to define if it's like products or not, but it will be used in combination with the other criteria. So it's not that one specific criteria will define of the likeness of a product, but it's an analysis which will be done by, in most of the cases, by the panel or by the appellate body. When we have an appellate body, you know that the situation is a bit complicated at the moment, but when we have an appellate body, they will examine the products, taking into consideration these criteria or also other criteria, and they will define on a case-by-case situation if it's a like product. So very complicated, and it's something that we cannot the Secretariat will never be in a position to tell you if two products are like products. So it's useless to contact somebody in the Secretariat and expose a specific case, because only the appellate body or the panel will be in a position to decide if two products are like products or if they're not like products. And this is really on a case-by-case situation, taking into consideration the product characteristics, but also the market characteristics. So quite complicated, very complicated to define. So Marinette, if we go to the next slide, just an illustration. You can see here that we have roller skates, but they're all different. So until which level these products are like products, because it could be that in our market, for a specific situation, they are like products, but in some other specific situations, they're not like products. And if we go to the next slide, here again, are those products, and this refers to the second sentence of Article 3.2, are those products directly competitive or substitutable products? They could be, it could be, it could not be the case, but it could be. So all this, in case of difference of interpretation between members, this will be brought to a panel, to the appellate body, and they will decide on each case if it is or not, if they are or not like products or directly competitive or substitutable products. But on practice, it's very complicated to define. Okay, so any question on MFN national treatment? We're going to the next basic principle. So if it's not the case, because it's for the case for anti-dumping is because it's a very specific case, which anti-dumping is very it's a very specific agreement also, because it applies to cases where specific firms or enterprise export their products in a specific with a specific price, and it only concerns this specific element. There's a question of there is a session on anti-dumping on trade remedies on Wednesday, 21st of July, and it could be the opportunity there to ask the question. But it's true that it's not used beyond that. So binding and commitments. So in this case, what we want to, and I will not spend a lot of time here because, as I mentioned, everything which is related to binding and commitments, I will explain that again on Monday. So basically, what is the general understanding is that members take some commitments and they apply this maximum level or this preferential level of access to the market on a non-discriminatory basis. What this specific principle applies only to goods and services. There is not such specific commitments. There are general obligations, but there are no specific commitments in relation to TRIPS, to intellectual property. So you will find specific commitments on specific goods and on specific services only in GATT and GATS, Article 2 of GATT and Article 16 of the GATS. Maybe if we can go to the next slide, please. So the general interpretation, the general understanding of that is that each contracting party, each member, nowadays with the WTO, and this is explained in the first paragraph of Article 2, shall accord to the commerce of the other contracting parties treatment no less favorable than that provided for in the appropriate part of the appropriate schedule annexed to this agreement. So what it means is that basically members take some commitments, they register or record these commitments in a book, which is a schedule or for goods and a specific list of commitments for the services. And then once this has been negotiated and is been included in this book, they have to afford for access to the market, which is at least as good as the one which is in the binding commitment. So this is in order to afford to offer some predictability to the import. You can imagine a situation, and there are some cases, obviously, not all goods for all members and not all services for all members have a commitment, have a binding commitment. But for those who are, even sometimes if it's high, it affords to have some predictability for exporters. So if we had not such bindings or commitments, it will be in a situation where from one day to the other, the tariff which is applied or the duty which is applied to a specific good could change and could go from say 5% to 500%. And this is obviously, they are not the best conditions for stability and for predictability of trade. I'm not going to go to explain further on this specific principle, because on next Monday I will explain it in detail. So we can go to the next slide, please. Again, please. Okay. So we'll come back to that, and this is how this is how the commitments are reported. I should have kept this slide for the. I thought I had removed it, but apparently I kept it here also. I will explain it again on Monday. The way these commitments are recorded is that we have schedules of commitments, which are reported, as you can see in the image. And each country has its own schedule, which reports for the commitments on goods. There are schedules for contracting parties and members, which you can see here. The last major exercise for having bindings was the Iran schedules, which you can see in this image. But they're also for new members. They report also the commitments in the protocols of accession. So both of these documents are legal instruments which are binding for the new members or for the current members of the WTO. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So another important basic principles is the prohibition of trade restrictions. So, for example, in relation with goods, the use of any trade restriction is prohibited, such as quotas. Obviously, there are some exceptions that we will see later. And this prohibition of trade restrictions applies also to services. So also in relation with services, the use of quotas is also prohibited for sectors and modes of supply. You will see what a mode of supply is when you will be presented with the GATS and the services, which appear in the member schedules of specific commitments. So why do we have this principle, this basic rule which prohibits to apply some trade restrictions? And it makes sense in the context of market access. To understand it, just think about a specific member that for a specific product has a very low customs duty. So he has let's say that he is it's totally duty-free. So the imports of chairs are duty-free. So you can export your chairs to these countries without paying any custom duty. Then you may have to pay internal taxes, VAT, but not specific duty. And this is a very sorry. This has a very high value because it means that you can compete on the same level in this specific market. But now, imagine the case where the entry of this product is duty-free, but at the same time, this country imposes a restriction on the number of chairs that can be imported. So you can only export 50 chairs per year. This totally circumvents and cancels the concession which has been negotiated and which has been offered by these members. So what we want to make by prohibiting these trade restrictions is to making sure that the commitments, the market access which has been negotiated is not annihilated or cancelled or circumvented by a quantity restriction. So that's the purpose of this rule in the GATT and in the GATS. So if we go to the next slide, what we can see, and Marina, you can click again, please. Yes. So what is important is that according to the GATT Article 11 in the first paragraph, no prohibitions or restrictions other than duty, taxes, or other charges, either made effective through quotas, import or export licenses, or other measures, shall be instituted or maintained by any member party on the importation of any product of the territory of any other member, also on the exports or sale for export of any product destined for the territory of any other member. So basically what he says is that the only instrument which is authorized under GATT rules are customs duties. Okay, and we see on Monday, we'll see what are these other charges that they are referred to in this Article 11. In some cases, you can apply other charges for some countries, some products. So basically, the main instrument of protection are duties. You cannot apply any type of quantitative restriction to any product. Obviously, there are some exceptions, and these exceptions are, Maynette, can you click again? And these exceptions are in GATT Article 11, paragraph 2. So the paragraph 1 says that we cannot apply quantitative restrictions, and paragraph 2 mentions that in some cases there is the possibility of applying some quantitative restrictions. I will just provide one or two examples of that. So, for example, when there's a temporary surplus of like domestic products, or when a country is seeking to import the quantities to be produced of any animal product, basically the main exception are for agricultural products and fisheries. And I'm sure that Alicia will probably develop on that, because this exception on agriculture and fisheries products, which is the main exception to this in Article 11, was drafted in 1947. So you can imagine that it's essentially because agriculture was a very sensitive sector at that time, and still today is a very sensitive sector. But things have changed since 1995, and since the adoption of agreement on agriculture, which Alicia already referred to in the introduction. And you will see in the specific session on agriculture what has changed in relation to quantitative restrictions, because agriculture, the agreement on agriculture has a specific provision which deals with this quantitative restrictions. So I won't say more about that right now, just saying that agriculture was covered. It's not covered anymore. Alicia will explain why. And nowadays, basically, this exception applies essentially to fish and fisheries products, due to the definition of products used in the WTO and the GATT. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. Okay, so here very quickly, because we have also a specific session on notification and transparency. There is, as I said, there is a kind of soft obligation, because there have never been to my knowledge, there's not been any major dispute settlement case because one country does not notify. There are essentially discussions which are made which take place which may take place in the committee or bilateral discussions, but to my knowledge, there has not been as important case on that. But still, the members, when they enter into the WTO, they have the obligation to publish trade regulations to notify, and most of the agreements, not to say all the agreements, have notification requirements. And they are also subject to the trade policy review mechanism, which has already been explained by Alicia, which is a transparency exercise through which all members have to go on a periodic basis. The frequency depending on the level of development of the not on the level of development of the importance in trade of each member of the WTO. So these are this is the obligation on transparency and and notification. But you will have a session, a specific session on notification and transparency in this course. Okay, so here we have covered the main basic principles. So I don't know if there is any question on the basic principles. We are now going to the exceptions to these basic principles. So before going to the exceptions, I will just give a few seconds in case you have questions. I don't see any questions, so we can move forward and we can continue the presentation. So we've seen and then explained at the beginning that at the beginning of the GATT in 47, contracting parties at that time, the contracting parties which took part in the negotiation or on the drafting of the GATT accepted to have some very strict rules, kind of rules of conduct in the trade relations. These are the basic principles that we have just seen. But as I mentioned also at the very beginning, probably that the negotiators at that time in the late 40s will never have accepted such strict rules of conduct if at the same time they would have not incorporated some flexibilities. Okay, and this is what we will see in this second part of the presentation. It's the flexibilities which are linked or related with the basic principles, but at the same time, there's a balance to be made. Negotiators accepted to have flexibilities, but these flexibilities should be justified, and they can be invoked and used only under specific circumstances and specific conditions. And these rights that we will see now is what we call the exceptions, derogations, exemptions to the basic principles. So let's go to the next slide. So what are these main, yes, thank you. These main exceptions that we will see today, we will essentially, and we'll see that in details, we'll spend much more time maybe on the first two categories, which are the waivers, the general exceptions, and the security exceptions. It's something that I will explain in more details. Why? Because all the other exceptions that you can see in the list, RTAs, regional trade agreements, safeguards, anti-dumping, countervailing measures, special and differential treatment, you all have, for all of these exceptions, you have a specific session in this course. So these exceptions, the last 4 bullet points, they will be covered in specific sessions. So there is no really need for me to go into the details of each of these categories. I will broadly and generally speak about them, say what they cover, in which situation you could invoke them, but I will not go in a lot of details about this exception. But the first two bullets, waivers and general exceptions and security exceptions, they should not be covered in other sessions. There might be references to general exceptions, but maybe not in the details of how to use them. So we will see that in more detail. Maybe not today because it's already 10 to 12, and I know that we end the session at 12, and I don't want to go beyond the time which was decided. But on Friday, I will continue the presentation and explain further the different categories. So maybe today we may be in a position to cover the waivers, and I will keep the others for Friday. So if you can just go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a summary of what I just mentioned, which is when can you invoke these rights? You have to be in a situation which justifies the use of this derogation. You have to meet certain conditions and or follow the forcing procedures. And in some cases, not to say most of the cases, you have to notify the measure that you're taking. And I see that there is a question about bilaterals, and I guess that there are bilateral agreements. Under the WTO rules, the bilateral agreements, and I hope that you're talking or referring to the bilateral trade agreements, they fall into the regional trade agreements. So the mention of regional trade agreements in the WTO has to be taken as very general, because it could not be general, it could not be regional, sorry. There's nothing in the WTO rules which says that the countries or the signatories of the agreement should be in the same region. We have regional trade agreements which cover different continents, so there's nothing necessarily about a region. And it starts at 2. So as soon as you have 2 in this RTA, which covers the bilateral agreements, they fall into the RTAs, the regional trade agreement exception. So RTAs, the Article 24 in the GATT and Article 5 in the GATT and the enabling clause cover what we call the bilateral agreements. I hope that I've answered the question which was posed in the chat. So just to move and try to cover the waiver. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay. So this is the text of the waiver as it is, as it comes from the Marrakesh Agreement, Article 9.3. And somebody can maybe just quickly, maybe in the chat, what does the Marrakesh Agreement covers? Is it goods? Is it services? Is it for intellectual property? What is the coverage of the Marrakesh Agreement? Anyone to write what it covers? Pertaining to derogations and exceptions, some countries always invoke and make different interpretations when trade friction takes place. I'm not sure to understand clearly the question. I will come back to that later maybe, but waiver, a waiver applies to what? It is written in the text actually. So if you read the text, you will have the answer. Okay, so Marinette, if you can go to the next slide because it will bring some, okay. So actually, it's not what is underlined, but however, as it is written in the 3rd paragraph of Article 9, covers any of the multilateral trade agreements. So be it goods, be it GATS, be it anything on TRIPS, it's covered by the waiver. The Marrakesh Agreement is the agreement which is the which institutionalized the trade in goods, services, and TRIPS as well. So TRIPS is also covered by the waiver and any other multilateral trade agreement. So it's actually the foundation of the WTO, the Marrakesh Agreement. It gives the rules which apply to the WTO and covers is the text which was actually adopted by members in 1995, which was ratified already in 94 actually, but enters into force in 95. And it's the agreement that was signed, the Marrakesh Agreement. All other multilateral agreements are just annexes to this Marrakesh Agreement. So the Marrakesh Agreement is the one that was signed and ratified. And the multilateral trade agreements, if you look at the way the book, the legal text is built, they are just annexes to this. So actually you could invoke a waiver, you could request a waiver for anything which falls in any of the goods-related agreement, anything which is under the GATS, and anything which is under the TRIPS. So it's very large, it's very broad again. And it's also broad because it's any obligation which is imposed. But what you need to justify or to demonstrate is that this waiver, as it is kind of a special joker that members sorry, I will come back to the questions. I'm reading the questions at the same time, so that's why I'm a bit confused sometimes. So what members have to demonstrate is that it's invoked in exceptional circumstances. Okay, so the exceptional circumstances should be demonstrated in the request for a member, and it should be adopted or approved or accepted by the members. In the text, in the article, paragraph 3 of Article 9 of Marrakesh Agreement, they say that 3/4 of the members, but basically the decision, as Alicia mentioned, are adopted by consensus. So, and you probably know that the rule of consensus appears in the same article, this Article 9, but in the first paragraph of Article 9. So Article 9.1 explains what is the consensus. I'm talking about the Marrakesh Agreement, and Article 9.3 refers to the waiver. So in this waiver, so you have to demonstrate the exceptional circumstances, and usually a waiver is granted for a duration of 10 years and will need to be examined on a yearly basis. So each year the members will examine. So it's really something exceptional. So basically the waiver, you ask for a waiver when you have no other flexibility that you can invoke. If there's a flexibility which is incorporated in any of the WTO agreements, be it the GATT, the GATS, the TRIPS, as we're going to see later with we're going to see on Friday with general exceptions, it's quicker and easier to go to this flexibility which already exists. But if what you need is not incorporated or is not included in any of the other flexibilities, then you go and ask for a waiver. But it's a process. You have to present your request to the Ministerial Conference. So just be aware that, as Alicia mentioned, the Ministerial Conference meets once every 2 years. We have one that is coming soon at the end of the year. But it meets only for 3-4 years. So in the period where the Ministerial Conference is not active, which is most of the time, the General Council can grant for a waiver on behalf of the Ministerial Conference. And this is something which is explained in Marrakesh Agreement in Article, I think it's Article 4, if I'm not wrong, of the Marrakesh Agreement. So the General Council replaces the Ministerial Conference when the Ministerial Conference is not active, which means most of the time, because the Ministerial Conference only takes place once every 2 years for 4 or 5 years. So, and this is anything under the sky or under the sun can be asked for a waiver, but it has to be accepted. So it's not an automatic process. Okay, so sorry, I'm coming back to the questions which were posed in the chat, and that will conclude this session. The other flexibilities, we will cover them on Friday. So the first question was pertaining to derogations and exceptions. Some countries always invoke and make different interpretations when trade friction takes place. I don't clearly understand this question, but what I can say is that it's not members that have to do interpretations. Members can have their own interpretation, but is no value of the interpretation of members if they cannot convince other members. The WTO is a members-driven organization, and the way the decisions are taken, it's by consensus. So for an interpretation by any member to have some value, they have to convince the other members. And that's why decisions in the WTO takes so long, because everything is negotiated, everything is discussed, either in some specific committees, or even bilaterally in other places. But a member as such, a single member has no power in the WTO. He has no power. He has no power to take any decision, to impose any decision. He could, of course, take or implement trade policy measures, but if they are not in conformity with the WTO rules, the risk is that this member, the decision or the measure will be challenged. If the member does not change that, it will be brought to the dispute settlement. There's a panel that will be analyzing this measure. There will be also, or the appellate body if there is an appeal. And finally, it's the panel or the appellate body that will take the decision and invoke the decisions and the measures, that the corrective measures that this member has to take. So a single member as such has no power. Jointly, members have the right to do interpretations, and this is also something that you will find in Marrakesh Agreement. There's an article that says that it's Article 10, I think, of Marrakesh Agreement, and only the members have the right to interpret the provisions of the WTO, but jointly, not individually. If I haven't responded to this question, we can always send an email or come back to this question later. So there is a question by asking for examples, I guess, of waivers. There are many examples of waivers that I can give you, and I will give you examples. And if you want more details, I can provide you with a full list. Actually, there is a list of waivers which are which you can find in the WTO website. But the most famous cases, probably, and I will give you two or three examples. We'll explain later what is the enabling clause, which is very important for developing countries, developing an LDCs, obviously. And this enabling clause was adopted in 1979 in the Tokyo round. But before that, this flexibility that are incorporated in the enabling clause were adopted through a waiver, through a decision made by members in 1971. Other cases of waivers are, for example, we have talked about bilateral agreements. We'll see later next Friday that if you want to be able to use flexibilities which are granted to regional trade agreements, whichever this agreement is, you have to follow some conditions which are explained in, which are defined in Article 24 and in the enabling clause. If you cannot follow these conditions because for any reason, but you still want to have a kind of special trade agreement with a specific partner, then you will have to ask a waiver. And there are many preferential agreements which do not follow the rules of the Article 24 of the GATT, or which do not follow the enabling clause, and they have been granted through a waiver. So anything which is not really in compliance with the WTO or GATT, TRIPS rules will need to be requested through a waiver. And finally, there are some members, we have made reference to the harmonized system in one of the questions with the bindings. We have made reference to the harmonized system. The harmonized system is a coding system for the products, and there are some updates of the harmonized system on a regular basis. In the transition period, some members have difficulties in applying the changes of the harmonized system, and they therefore ask some waivers to have time to apply the harmonized system. So these are examples of waivers. One of the waiver, I can see that there is a TRIPS waiver for LDCs. That's correct. There's a waiver also that was adopted to grant developing countries or developing members with China position to do so, to grant preferences to LDCs. In the WTO rules, if you read the GATT, if you read the enabling clause, there's nothing in the WTO rules which allow developing members to grant preferences to LDCs. There are rules which allow developed members to grant preferences to developing members, but not developing members to grant preferences to LDCs. This is a decision that was taken, I think, 20 years ago, if I'm not wrong, and it was adopted through a waiver. So what you have to know, basically, is that waiver, you can ask anything under a waiver, and you can ask things which are not included incorporated in the WTO provisions, but you have to justify it. You have not only to justify it, but this has to be adopted by members. I'm stopping here because I went beyond time for, I think, 10 minutes with the questions. I will respond to any question which I'm in a position to explain or to respond on Friday. I won't go any longer in this presentation. I thank you for your attention. I'm very sorry to have gone 10 minutes beyond schedule, and I will continue with this same presentation on basic principles next Friday. If you have any question, do not hesitate to send an email to genevacourse@wto.org, and we'll take these questions and share it maybe next Friday for the benefit of all of you. I hope that it was clear enough. Wish you a good end of the morning, a good afternoon, a good evening for those who are in different time zones, and I meet you again on Friday. Thank you for your attention, and enjoy your day and Thursday, and see you on Friday. Bye bye. Thank you very much.